Welcome to the Separation Guide podcast. I'm Jack Whelan, Mediator and Barrister. The Separation Guide is the starting point for you to find a better way to separate. In this podcast, we interview a range of experts to share with you key insights to support your separation journey. Thanks for joining us. Friends, welcome. It's Jack Whelan here. I'm a barrister, mediator, a former Chief of Staff to the Commonwealth Attorney General and Senior Advisor to two Prime Ministers. I'm also the co-founder of the Separation Guide, which is an online service which educates, triages and connects people who are going through separation and divorce to the services which they need. Welcome to a very important Separation Guide facilitated podcast. We're focusing on the pressure of the pandemic, the pressure which this wretched COVID-19 virus and more recently this even more wretched Delta variant is having on families right across Australia. I'm joined by Dr Mandy-Jo Ellis from Relationspace, a wonderful provider of support for families experiencing divorce, separation and family conflict. G'day, Mandy, how are you?
Well, thank you, Jack. How are you?
Terrific, thank you. I'm also joined by Carolyn Devries. Carolyn is CEO of Australia's first non-profit law firm, New Way Lawyers. G'day, Carolyn.
Hi, Jack. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. And also I'm joined by Ryan Cropper from New Way Lawyers, who is a practitioner in family law. Ryan, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Thanks kindly for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So a couple of things about our guest. Firstly, Dr Mandy-Jo Ellis has a doctorate in educational and developmental psychology, a master's in school psychology. She is a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and Criminal Justice Studies. Mandy has extensive experience working with children, adolescents and families in a variety of settings, providing planning, placement, treatment and assessment services involving highly complex mental health issues. Mandy's always pursued an interest in the interface of psychology and law, which is a often misunderstood or less than well understood area of the human experience in my own judgment. Mandy's worked in a secure ward of a specialty mental health hospital with adults who've engaged in criminal behaviours, with adjudicated youth in a secure juvenile justice facility, and as a family consultant attached to both the Launceston Registry and the Sydney Registry. The mission of Relationspace is to provide effective evidence-based interventions and services to help provide stronger relationships and negotiate healthy ways to cope with relationship changes. So check out the Relationspace at relationspace.com.au. It's a terrific business and a wonderful service. Carolyn Devries, as CEO of Australia's first non-profit law firm, is an experienced practitioner holding a Bachelor of Laws and a graduate diploma in legal practice. Carolyn is admitted to practice in the High Court of Australia, the Supreme Court of Queensland and the Supreme Court of New South Wales, holding a Bachelor of Commerce and a Master's in Human Services, specialising in the management of non-profit organisations. Carolyn has been publicly recognised and awarded for her work over many years, but especially in establishing New Way Lawyers, as I've mentioned, Australia's first non-profit law firm. In 2012, Carolyn was a finalist in the Queensland Telstra Business Women's Awards, being nominated for the Community and Government Innovation and Young Business Women's categories, and she was the winner of the Community and Government Award. Carolyn is a recognised voice in the legal and community sectors. She's also a regular columnist in the Seniors newspaper. And as an aside, the word on the street is that Carolyn grew up on a farm in central West New South Wales, spending most Sunday afternoons with her family checking the sheep in the paddocks. And whilst her mum and dad would tell her to go and bring back the rogue sheep, secretly Carolyn will reveal to friends that she actually cheered on the rebel sheep and admired their tenacity. It's therefore completely in keeping with that sometime later Australia's first not-for-profit law firm was born. Ryan Cropper has a wide range of experience working on challenging family law and estate matters, Recently, he's worked on obtaining an order for a parent to have sole parental responsibility and care of their daughter due to family violence concerns. He's contested an application for a protection order and had that application withdrawn. He has secured an arrest warrant against a parent who failed to appear at court after relocating interstate with the child. So as a practitioner, Ryan certainly sees the good, the bad and the ugly in front of our court system. There's also a rumour floating around that Ryan likes to whistle whilst he works. Some favourites on his playlist, I'm told, are Baby Shark, if he has been listening with his daughter, to music with his daughter, whilst at other times it is That's Life by Frank Sinatra. Welcome, Ryan, again, and a shout out to your colleagues who hopefully enjoy whistling. Friends, so to a very important and difficult time in Australia. At this moment, as we speak, Australia, about 80% of Australia is in lockdown. And that itself is a term largely unfamiliar to all of us just 18 months ago. Much of Australia is also subject to curfews. There are protests in major cities about the loss of freedoms right across the country, and the effect on families is profound. I want to share with you the most recent statistics from the Separation Guide Q&A. Across the last 3 months, that is in the 3 months to August, this is what the Separation Guide has observed. A 90% increase in requests for legal advice, an 81% increase in people seeking psychological support, a 48% increase in requests for financial advice, tellingly and sadly a 78% increase in people seeking access to violence prevention services, a 42% increase in people seeking marriage counselling, a 41% increase in requests for accounting services, and a 55% increase in requests for support to finance their separation. So plainly, friends, we are a country under extreme stress, and it's having an impact on family life far and wide. To you, Mandy, firstly, what are your observations about how the pandemic is impacting upon families in Australia right now? Mandy.
Sure, Jack. In times of crisis, it can bring opportunities where the strengths of some families mitigating some of the COVID-related stresses. However, there are so many changes, health concerns, economic pressures, social isolation, obviously, radically different work arrangements for families, people working from home, trying to homeschool their children, including loss of employment, changes of economic circumstances. So COVID-19 and lockdown is having a massive contribution to really intensifying existing family tensions and vulnerabilities or risks that were already present. So these involuntary protracted time together can make these minor irritations become really major pressure points for these families. So it's really increasing mental health issues, addiction issues such as substance abuse, gambling. We've seen alcohol sales go through the roof. So in couples and families who are trying to separate, I know anecdotally and as well as your statistics, there is a huge increase. Due to some economic circumstances, there's more families too who are also separated under the one roof because economically they can't separate. So that is certainly a far more challenging emotional environment. The only other thing I'd add in terms of children themselves in this circumstance rather than families generally is that with lockdown and schools being closed, grandparents isolating, there are far fewer eyes on children at the moment as well. So there are fewer checks and balances that would normally be in place to help keep them safer as well.
Thanks, Mandy. Carolyn, what are you seeing out there at the moment?
Similar to what Mandy said, Jack, there's just an enormous amount of stress across the board on families in all different areas, emotionally and financially. So I think everything that Mandy said, we've seen as well. But from a legal perspective, to drill it down, I think some of the things that we're seeing is people that are coming to us with stressful relationship situations and feeling as though they need to leave, but not sure whether they should leave in light of the current circumstances, uncertainty about what separating looks like in a pandemic, what resources will be available to them moving forward, what services will be available to them moving forward. So I think we're seeing people in very difficult situations where the relationship is not healthy, but they're really needing to or seeing no way out and having to stay at the moment. The other big thing that we're seeing is that people who had previously finished through the legal system and closed out of that process are actually being brought back into the system again, due to the fact that, when the family law system was set up and people were working through parenting arrangements in particular, the pandemic wasn't in mind, 20, 10 or even 5 years ago. So people have set up parenting arrangements and parenting structures that were good at that time, but they don't stand up to the stress of the inherent complexities of the pandemic situation that we're dealing with now. We're seeing a lot of frustration of current arrangements that are just no longer workable through no fault of the parents themselves. I think the other thing that we're seeing, which Mandy touched on, is just the very difficult day-to-day arrangements that separated parents are needing to work through and communicate about, particularly when there are lockdowns and when children can't go to school and parents can't go to work, what that looks like. Can the current parenting arrangement be followed, or is it a case where one parent is an essential worker and can't have the children and the other parent needs to have them at home while they're working from home? So we're just seeing a lot of things that were never contemplated that the family law system would have to deal with, and we're seeing that the system's needing to adapt very quickly. The final thing that we're noticing is that at the same time as demand for services has increased significantly, the actual ability to supply these services in family law and domestic violence has actually reduced back. When the pandemic first started, we saw a lot of the community legal clinics and legal aid shut down their face-to-face services and moved to online telephone services. But the problem was that people didn't know how to access these services. So we kind of saw a perfect storm of an increase in demand for services, but at the same time a pulling back in the actual supply of those services.
Perfect storm indeed. Thank you, Carolyn. That's the most apt descriptor. Ryan, what are you seeing at the coalface, sir?
Well, I agree with Carolyn and Mandy in terms of, if I could sum it up in one word, I'd say disorientating. Unfortunately, the legal system can be complex as it is, owing to the complexities of COVID-19 and all those things that Caroline just talked about. Mums and dads are going through extremely stressful situations where they may be faced without employment and then also trying to navigate the family law system. Our Federal Circuit Court and Family Court of Australia have done a wonderful job in responding to that, and there's been implementations like the COVID-19 list that can assess the parties and try and relieve some of that pressure. Unfortunately, like everything, it still is a process, and parties are still going through this on a daily basis. It is an extremely complex and emotional area of law, but fortunately, there is good response from the registrars and judges of the Federal Circuit Court and Family Court of Australia.
Yeah, it's certainly a system under stress trying to respond to this new level of demand. And as you say, Carolyn, the pandemic is affecting all parts of society in different ways and having unintended impacts, unforeseen impacts on the family court system. It's good to see the family court system responding in the way that it is. There's huge resources being applied and a call out to many people to come forward and provide pro bono assistance. So that's a good thing, and that's welcome. And I think all of us as practitioners in the space, it's very important to acknowledge that. Mandy, back to you. You mentioned at the moment that one of the impacts of the pandemic is that it's forcing people who are minded to separate, but because of the reality of lockdowns, many people are forcing to separate from being under the one roof, so are separating under the one roof. What sort of challenges does that create for a couple? And what's the best advice you can give to people who are going through a challenge of separating under the one roof in a pandemic? Mandy?
Very, very difficult situation, and it's on the increase. People are having to, economically, they cannot afford to move apart, and they're also, to some degree, trying to protect their children from the impact of COVID-19 as well. It can create a lot of increased stress for both the parents and the children. Communication, which is fraught often. It's more difficult to keep the children protected from the difficult communication the parents are having. It's a highly emotional time. There's a lot of grief, a lot of anger, and all kinds of feelings taking place. And with everyone under the one roof 24/7, very difficult to keep a lid on those things for any length of time. The rollout of digital services has provided these particular circumstances with some respite. But as Carolyn said before, it really does presuppose that parents are adequately resourced and generally tech savvy. So while that is seen as a mitigating factor for them in that they can access services privately while still at home, it still can create an extra level of stress in that digital communication and non-face-to-face service provision at what Ryan has pointed out as well is such an extremely stressful time is generally what people have been used to seeking.
And of course, there are just very practical things as well. I know that often when I'm mediating between couples, we'll go to great lengths to ensure that there are private sessions, conversations that can be had in private, because there may be things that need to be said privately and without the knowledge of another party. That's harder when you're under the same roof. So behaviourally, obviously, it's challenging, but even the logistics of seeking advice and then the logistics of participating in a process itself can be even more challenging. Mandy, I was going to say that often we talk about the importance for parents when they're going through separation and divorce to model the right behaviours, even in disagreement, to try and model the best behaviours that they can. How does one do that under this sort of pressure?
It's extremely difficult to ask people who are in the breakdown of often long-standing relationships to explore avenues for assistance. It's often extremely emotional. They have a story to tell. They're under intense pressure. And often their emotional responses at the times of these interventions are they're in grief. And then to have to do that, as you said, in somewhat privacy, and then try and regroup and then face their family who's just outside the next door. It's really, really difficult for them to keep their feelings private, to keep information from their children, for their children not to be as influenced by the conflict.
If I could jump in there, Jack, I think that, this is heightened even further when we're talking about families that are in situations of where there's family violence and domestic violence. The ability to access services for those particular needs when someone's under the same roof is just incredibly and inherently difficult. The ability for someone to hop on a phone, even though many services have moved to provision of services by phone, is not feasible when the other person is actually in the same house and potentially listening in, and the person who needs help is worried about the fallout of that call. It's really interesting. One of the experiences that we had as a firm in terms of adapting to that digital service provision quite quickly, particularly in the face of community legal services and legal aid drawing back, was we developed an initiative called Lunch with a Lawyer, and that's an online Facebook group where one of our lawyers every weekday from 12 to 1 was online, and people could actually ask their questions in the Facebook group, either on the group page or alternatively via private message. And what was really interesting is we had some incredibly high usage of that during the pandemic, and that still continues to now. But in addition, we had this person who used the service and they actually responded saying that they were using it from the bathroom. They were under the same roof and they were in lockdown, but they felt comfortable that they were able to actually get that advice because they weren't on the phone having to talk about it. So I think it's been particularly challenging in the settings where there has been family and domestic violence.
Great service, Carolyn. So lunch with the lawyer on Facebook.
Yes, that's right.
And what's the take-up been like for that, Carolyn? I imagine it.
Yeah, we started it when the pandemic started last year, and the group has now grown to over 1,500 members. But in addition, we also do things like we actually, in addition to responding individually to every question that's asked, we also do a lot of care activities. So we sometimes do free book giveaways that are books that are focused on, how to communicate effectively and just different books about perhaps financial stress and how to plan a budget. So we sometimes do free books on there. And also we also open the group sometimes up for the members to actually share their self-care tips. So, for example, what keeps you strong when you're going through a separation and divorce, or what keeps you strong during lockdown. So we've been able to not only make that a legal resource, but also a space of encouragement and positivity for people who are going through these situations.
Thank you, Carolyn. And it's a fantastic service. Ryan, I mentioned earlier that off the Separation Guide's website, there's been a 78% increase in people seeking access to violence prevention services. Are you seeing more and more of these types of matters being heard before the courts at the moment? I'm interested in what you're observing in that violence prevention space.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we're incredibly fortunate that where we are, I'm from our Burleigh Waters office, so I sit on the border of New South Wales and Queensland. So, I mean, in terms of the operation of the Magistrates Court, I mean, it was by phone for a period, but then largely back in person. Even in terms of our potential client inquiries, when they call through, there's a lot of domestic violence questions, a lot of family violence as well, compared to this time last year when kind of COVID was just rearing its ugly head. It does seem that there's been a substantial increase in domestic violence questions, especially around police-led applications, and seems to be a lot more police intervention in the following 12 months.
Mandy, back to you. One of the challenges, obviously, is especially being in lockdown, separating generally, but certainly separating in lockdown or during a pandemic, is how to communicate well, how to organise one's thoughts, communicate with someone who may not want to communicate. And indeed, many people have their own communication challenges. What sort of advice do you give people who may enter the relation space and it becomes fairly clear that they're actually either not communicating very well or finding it difficult to communicate? What are some practical tips you can give to people who need to improve their communication in a time of this great stress?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jack. At the Relationspace, we provide a lot of support to families on this issue, and it has definitely been on the increase. There are a variety of different things that we try to work with families in this regard. Some of them work through parenting applications on their phones where they can exchange information without coming into contact with one another. Aside from just text or email, we offer parenting coordination as well, which assists with communication, where communication can be monitored by us between the parties so that we can assist them with communication that's in a written form. Certainly, those are the more extreme ends of the communication difficulties, but generally protecting children as best they can from their views about their parental conflict is really vital. Otherwise, you wind up with children who have split loyalty and feel very divided at a time when they're already experiencing so much change within their family structure and now within COVID-19 as well. So it adds such an extra burden to these young children, children of all ages actually, which is noticed by the children depending on their age groups to varying degrees. But certainly managing to try and shield children from the parental conflict and the views and feelings that they have about that is really vital to children's mental health and to the outcomes for them in this regard.
Mandy, and further to that, what does modelling the right behaviours actually look like? And obviously it's done because it makes for an enhanced and much more amicable separation. But what does it look like to the kids? What does modelling the right behaviours look like to children? Mandy?
It looks, what it appears for the children is that they are allowed to have their own feelings, that the children don't expect to meet the needs of the parent. The parent is still the one meeting the needs of the children, that they're kept shielded and less aware of the parental conflict or any of the history between the parents about how things have arisen. So to them, it's the best outcome for the children is where they're largely unaware. They know that their family has changed in structure, and that alone is such a massive, all-encompassing change for them, which can impact them differently depending on their developmental stage. But really, our focus is on helping the parents to learn the vital importance of being able to hold back around their children and around, not just when they're physically present, but when they're in earshot, keeping good boundaries with them, not exposing them to the use of checking parents' emails or having access to other correspondence between parents, things of that nature, Jack.
Thank you, Mandy. Carolyn, in the context of, and also to you, Ryan, in the context of representing people who may be in a less than amicable separation, in that context, how do you go about advising your clients? And many matters have to go to court. That's just the reality of it. Some matters cannot be resolved outside of the court system. And so many matters do have to end up in a courtroom. That's why the courts are there. But in that context, how do you advise clients in relation to some of these behavioural issues, which Mandy's just referenced? How do parents model the right behaviours in the context of going through a very difficult litigation? First to you, Carolyn, and then I'm interested in your views, Ryan, as well. Carolyn.
Overall, I think the most important thing that a family lawyer can do is actually explain very robustly to a client the principles of the Family Law Act and that it's based on the best interests of the children, and trying to get the clients to shift their focus above their own issues, which are not insignificant. It's not denying that, there might be hurt and there might be loss and there might be grief that they're going through, but trying to elevate them above those issues to focus on what's best for the children and telling them that that is what the family law system is going to be focused on. Practically, that looks like connecting clients at an early stage to lots of support services that are relevant to their situation. So to counselling, to, financial advisors if there's, fears and worries about what the financial future looks like. So connecting them with appropriate support services that are relevant to them. Internally for us, that also means connecting them to our client care program. So for any client that's involved in a legal matter and working with one of our lawyers who's helping them resolve that, we also offer a voluntary client care program, which gives them access to a range of different things. So there's a weekly blog that goes out that talks to their situation. So, how to positively communicate, how to deal with grief and loss. It also helps them with some of the practical things they might be dealing with. So if they are struggling financially, we have the ability to do food hampers for the clients. They also have access to our free resource library, which has books for mums, books for dads, books for kids that get them focused on, really moving forward and trying to resolve this in an amicable way. And I guess the last thing that I'd like to speak to there, Jack, is just, we always approach working with clients from an amicable point of view, trying to get people to understand that they need a future working relationship with the other parent, that, at some point there's going to be weddings to go to and graduations, and they need to have some semblance of a working relationship with the other parent. Now, sometimes we do see clients that come to us, and it is the exception rather than the rule, which is good, but they are really hell-bent on using the process to punish the other parent. And if that's the case, we'll do some good reality checking about maybe we aren't the best fit law firm for you because we don't want to cause any more, collateral damage. Sometimes it's a case if a client's presenting like that, we feel that we can manage it and we should stay on in the matter to really help that process and help get them on track with being more constructive and positive in the way they're approaching their parenting matter. But sometimes if it really feels like they're not going to take on board advice, it may also be best to say that, look, we're not the right fit for you.
Parents for life is the reality. And it's a reality which people need to understand, and hopefully they have that capability to understand that. I find that when I'm mediating, it is just important to consistently point that out, because the current relationship has changed. It won't be returned to, but there is a new relationship and there are still children. Ryan, further to my question to Carolyn, in the cut and thrust of daily litigation, you must experience moments when you have concern for the well-being of children who are in the proximity of that litigation. How do you go about broaching the subject when you start to have concern for how a child may be influenced by the legal proceedings which they're either a party to or observing? Ryan?
Yeah, certainly. I think one thing, it's being cognizant of the fact that, as Caroline and Mandy have both said, it's the importance to act in the best interest of the children. Unfortunately, sometimes you do see matters where, either one of the parents might not be acting in a way that we'd consider, or the Family Law Act would consider to be acting in the best interest of the children. I think too, I fully agree with what Caroline was saying in terms of reality checking clients too. I think part of being a family law practitioner is unfortunately having the hard conversations. I can see that sometimes people believe that they're acting in the best interest, but perhaps there might be a better way to go about those actions, perhaps a more amicable way, especially in regard to COVID-19, where, I think it was about the 26th of March 2020 when the Honourable Chief Justice Whelan released a media release talking about parenting orders and COVID-19. And one of the things that I try and do now following that is, when we do get new matters on where it looks particularly contentious, or it's going to be one of those matters that's going to proceed all the way through to final hearing, is, having a think and having a talk about what we can concede on and what it is that we have to hold firm on, and then trying to act sensibly and reasonably. Unfortunately, sometimes family law practitioners can kind of adopt the areas or grievances of their clients, and we try and remain as supportive as we possibly can without getting invested in the emotional side of things, whilst also being there to support them.
Yeah, it's a point very well made. Often, and I hear what you're saying, I think it is a minority, but there are people who will cheerlead their clients into a courtroom. That's a sad reality, and that's plainly not the job. The job is to speak very frankly and have those difficult conversations. I'll go to you, Carolyn, and then to Robin again, and then finish with Mandy. Carolyn, one of the hardest things to do in family law is explain to someone what fairness actually is, especially in the context of people having a preconceived view that fairness is either 50-50, or in terms of a split of the asset pool, or fairness demands that I should get out of the marriage what I put in. I'm interested in how you go about explaining what fairness is in family law and how it operates, and then to you, Ryan. Carolyn.
Yeah, that's a difficult question, Jack, and I think it is one that comes up a lot in practice. I think one of the tools that I use with clients is that you can very clearly have your lawyer's hat and your layman's hat. And like what Ryan said, sometimes you can take off your lawyer's hat and put on your layman's hat and really empathise with the client and say, look, understand why you're feeling that way, understand why you have those views, and a lot of people would probably relate to that. An example that I can give you on that is when a party to the relationship comes in and they've been cheated on. There's often a real focus on the other party should be punished, and particularly in property settlement, that they should receive less because of that. So I think being able to empathise from a layman's point of view, wearing that layman's hat, but at the same time then putting back on the lawyer's hat and saying that's not what the law says, this is what the law says, and explaining that if their goal is to have those issues aired, they're actually going to be very disappointed when they get to court, because there really isn't a forum to share their story as such and to have those issues heard. It's very procedural. It's a very clear application of the law to a factual situation. So I think being able to show that empathy and humanity, but at the same time being able to be very clear about what the law says.
Yeah, and look, I completely agree. It is a daunting moment for someone to enter a courtroom for the first time and actually to realise, if they had not been advised previously, that much of their story, whilst entirely relevant to them and important, may not be relevant in the context of a courtroom. Ryan, you must see people entering the court system with a degree of what we'll call optimism bias. How do you go about managing that, given that your experience will be that often people with an optimism bias will enter the courtroom and perhaps be let down by what actually happens?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's one of those things where, as Caroline was saying, it is procedure-based. It is not an opportunity to air your grievances and things like that. Whilst there are contributions-based entitlements, if we're talking family law property matters, certainly with parenting and things like that too, a lot of times we see some people and they might have a preconceived notion of what, the first return date's going to look like, and think everything's going to be resolved and it's going to be one and done, when unfortunately, there's things where in parenting matters, like it might be appropriate to have appointed an independent children's lawyer or go and see a family consultant to have a family report generated. And I think it's one of those things where it comes down to providing really, really clear advice and doing so on a step-by-step basis, where sometimes, as we can all appreciate, the difficulty of going through separation plus the difficulty that COVID presents, and then people coming to court on the first occasion and, like you say, being a little bit let down by, I wanted the house sold, or I wanted, this or that, or it has to go to an interim hearing for spousal maintenance, and just understanding the process. And I think as practitioners, where we need to be really acute is providing that advice step by step, making sure that the clients understand where their matter's up to, making sure they understand the court processes and they're given an opportunity to ask those specific questions, because that way you can avoid the feeling of being let down, which can, come with its own series of problems further on.
I think also, to jump in there, Jack, one of the things that you also need to do with a client is to actually tell them about their very worst outcome. And that's a conversation you need to not be scared to have with a client. So often they are focused on, their best outcome, or even possibly something less than their best outcome, but they certainly don't have in their mind anything like the worst outcome. So that's something that we do very early on in the process, including in the initial consultation, depending on the level of information and details that we have. But certainly once we have all the available information and advice, is actually telling them what the worst case outcome can look like. And before they go to court, because you don't do a client any service by, going off and filing in court and then telling them what the worst case could look like.
Indeed, it is.
Back in, I think one thing too that, is something that, however it may be a little bit minor, is something to consider that's good too, is, with the courts not being face-to-face at present, there is the potential for saving costs, even with travelling to and from court appearances and things like that, to be able to just call in from your office or even at home if you're in lockdown and make your appearance, whilst it might only take 20 or 30 minutes. Sometimes, depending on your location, there can be other fees for travel and things like that. So clients can experience some of the benefit, although talking to that as well, there is the issue there with sometimes perhaps not being able to have that personal impression where you get to meet your lawyer, especially if you're coming on board right now in the midst of the pandemic and lockdown.
Yeah, there's real pros and cons with that, isn't there? One of the things that I've noticed as I think of virtue of all of the online work that we have to do is that people, going to court is an event, and even attending a mediation can be an event, and it can cause quite a lot of apprehension. What I find is that attending things online, they're regarded slightly more like meetings than events. And it's a meeting that you attend with a coffee in hand, and it just tends to be, it's very context specific, but it does tend to be a little bit less stressful. Friends, just to finalise, and I'm interested in Mandy's views in this in particular, there is another cohort of people here. We've spoken a lot today about people under a lot of pressure and trying to manage how to separate or how to communicate, how to organise their thoughts under the pressure of a pandemic and a lockdown and curfews, and that's a large group of people. The other cohort, based on my experiences and perhaps yours as well, are people who perceive the impact of the pandemic and lockdowns to be robbing them of time and experiences that they would ordinarily have. And that seems to have forced them decision-making around relationships. A lot of people are saying to me, look, we've just had a good, hard chat about where we're at, and when the pandemic is over, we actually want a separation to be finalised. These are amicable people who've used the reality of being in lockdown, have some tough discussions of their own. That presents its own psychological challenges. Mandy, what is your advice to people who are in that cohort who are experiencing a different type of separation, sponsored in a different way by the same pandemic? Mandy?
That's a very good question, and I know that Carolyn and Ryan have both touched on, and yourself, managing people's expectations. We see at the Relationspace people from all the way through, from pre-separation, considering separating, and all the way through to into the court system, well into the court system. So I just want to clear your question, Jack. Was it helping people who are staying together to see the pandemic out and then separate afterwards?
Oh, it's people who've made a decision to separate because the reality of the pandemic has actually sponsored in them to query their relationship.
Oh, absolutely. Having this involuntary time together as in a much more intense way than they otherwise would have is a real tinderbox for a lot of people who had already had issues underpinning their relationships to begin with. And it has been an experience with a lot of people who suddenly thought their relationship was kind of okay, and now they've been together in this lockdown and gone, whoa, this is just not good. And it's very difficult to try and navigate this. Seeking assistance as early as possible is really beneficial, and trying to stay out of the court system as much as possible. So whether that's coming to places like the Relationspace for early intervention family therapy, whether it's mediation, family dispute resolution, getting as much sorted between you in as early as you can through the situation prior to even considering court procedures would be my advice and our position.
Thanks, Mandy. Friends, our time is nearly at an end. I'd like to thank you all very much for providing such valuable insights, sharing your experience and lending your expertise to the discussion. It's been very, very useful. I think the one thing that we can perhaps all agree on is that no two experiences are the same. And so the best advice that we would all give to people is that when you are going through a separation, inform yourself as best you can. There are wonderful providers out there who can assist. Access that information in a way that you can, whether it's Facebook Lunch with Lawyers, terrific idea, Carolyn, or through accessing the services of Relationspace. informing oneself, educating oneself really does increase the chances of making the best decisions that you can to assist you and your family through a difficult time. Mandy Ellis from Relationspace, Carolyn Devries and Ryan Cropper from UA Lawyers, thank you very much for joining the Separation Guides podcast on the pressure of the pandemic. Thank you, friends.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Carmen.
Thank you for listening to the Separation Guide podcast. If you're thinking about separating but aren't sure what steps to take next, take our free 5-minute Q&A. It explains how divorce and separation work and helps connect you with experts and services to get you through the maze. Just head to theseparationguide.com.au. From podcasts to templates, our website also has plenty of free resources to get you started.